Hello and welcome again. This is a video summary for week 3. I'm Associate Professor Chris Fleming and this is What is the Human? And the topic for this week was the human as the language animal. Now we're going to have to go into two specific things. There is what human language is. That's obvious to understand, and the differences between that and non-human language or non-human forms of communication. So let's go to the point which really a lot of the lecture was based around, is that human language is distinct from animal forms of communication. Now, to put it very simply, you'd say animals don't have language. Now, obviously, it depends what you mean by language. So it doesn't mean that animals don't communicate. Obviously, we know animals communicate. We know animals have emotions. We know animals are capable of suffering. But animal communication is also really, really complex in certain instances. And in fact, insect communication can be incredibly complex. And some forms of animal communication, you might even say, are cultural, right? So there are forms of bird song that birds inherit and are taught by other birds. So the argument here is not that animal communication is not rich, that it's not complicated and so on. The argument is that human language is distinct in a number of important respects. Now, this isn't just a technicality. This, in fact, tells us something very deep about what it means to be a human being. But before we get into that, we've got to ask what language is, even to start with. So if you'd ask most people what language is, I'd presume, and this is from experience, they'd say language is a means of communication. And you know what? That's right. Language is the way in which we communicate. The idea here is that language is the kind of wrapping we put around thought. So to get my thought from my head into your head, I need language. And language is going to be this transport device, or this wrapping to allow us to communicate with each other. And this is absolutely true. But language is actually something far more radical than that. That is, language is not just a means of communication of thought. Language is the means by which thought is formulated. I'll say that again. Language is the means by which thought is formulated. That is, human thinking occurs in language. That is, we don't have a thought and then we go, oh, now I need to kind of really write, put that into language. Human thinking is linguistic by its very nature. That doesn't mean we don't have other forms of perception and so on. We have our senses. We have, we're able to feel fear, and we're able to see light and all these kinds of things. But human cognitive processes are inherently linguistic in nature. Okay, so to put it in this way, you'd say language is not just forms of communication of thought. Language is a formulation of thought. Now, Benjamin Lee Whorf was the anthropologist who originally started to investigate this area. And in this week's reading, Lara Boroditsky develops a kind of Whorfian idea and looks at the ways in which human thought, differences in human thought, reflect human differences in language. And so she was looking primarily at Indigenous Australian languages, and the fact that in a lot of them there is no terms for left or right, so there's no relative direction. Okay, the only directions that can be given are north, south, east, and west. That is, universal compass directions. Now that has quite a radical, effect on human thought in a number of ways. You can think about it this way. If I'm sitting here, then my left and my right is always relative to me. Okay? So the world is what it is by virtue of how it rates, where it is in relation to me. If this is my left and this is my right, it's different from your left and right. And if I turn, then my left and right change as well. Now, universal compass directions don't do that. I have to orient myself to the world. Now, if you do that and you grow up doing that and only being able to do that, then your directional sense is going to be vastly improved, and arguably your whole attitude towards your place in the world is going to be different as well. I mean, it doesn't have to be as radical as this. One of the things I did during the lecture was get people who spoke another language to think about a joke in their own language or an amusing expression, to see the extent to which this cannot be translated into English, or if it can be translated into English, all the humour and the nuance drops out of it. So this is the idea that thought is embedded in a particular kind of language, and you can't separate the thinking from the language in this way. So human thought is linguistic. Now, the second thing we talked about, and I mentioned it up front, was the difference between human communication and human thought, that is human language, and non-human language. So in order to do this, we looked at Terence Deacon's work in a book of his called The Symbolic Species. Deacon's a neuroscientist, but the points he makes are essentially philosophical. Deacon draws on an American philosopher, C.S. Peirce, and talks about three kinds of signs in the world: iconic, indexical, and symbolic. An iconic sign is a sign that looks like the thing that it represents. So a photograph of someone looks like the thing it represents. Okay. Or in a situation where a dog's growling at you, it's baring its teeth and so on. That looks like what it's representing, which is bite. I'm going to bite you. It's a warning. Okay. So that's an iconic sign. An indexical sign is characterized by a causal relationship. So the sign refers to its object through causation. So a smoke from a fire. So the smoke is the sign, the fire is what it refers to. The smoke is a causal outcome of the fire. Skid marks on the road, they refer to, a car tire, going back in terms of causation. Blood spatter on the wall. I said in the lecture that CSI is essentially, the whole show is based around indexical terms, or a thermometer, right, is causally related to the heat. It signifies heat. And the way it operates is through the expansion of mercury. I'm not sure they still use mercury in thermometers, but the expansion and contraction of material in there that's related to the world outside it. So iconic is something that looks like what it represents. Indexical is causally related to what it represents. And the third one is symbolic. And this is an entirely different kind of sign. Symbolic signs have got no resemblance to what they refer to, have no necessary causal relationship to what they refer to. In fact, they're completely arbitrary. So, in French, we call, you call a cat le chat. In English, it's cat. Now, why do we do that? Well, there are historical reasons, but there's no reason we need to call cats cats. Someone could say, all right, from now on, when we say cat, we mean dog, and when we say dog, we mean cat. That is, the word cat doesn't look anything like a cat. It's not causally related to a cat. It's completely arbitrary. And this is the thing about human signification, is that there is no necessary relation, either of resemblance or causation, between the sign and what it represents. Now, this gives rise to a whole series of features of thought that aren't available if you don't have that. And Deacon's hypothesis is that animals have two of the three. They have indexical signs and they have iconic signs, but they don't have symbolic signs in the way that humans, they don't have symbolic signs. Now, what that means is that human thought is very, very different. And it allows us to live in a virtual world as well as a real world, apart from other things. And so there are things in human language, in addition, that are formally unique. That is, the features them distinguish them from other forms of non-human communication. So there is, in human language, there are nouns, there are verbs, there's singular, plural distinctions. There's tensing, right? So human can say, yesterday you did this, but today, yesterday you said you'd do this, but today you're doing that. I hope in the future this is going to happen. None of these features occur in animal languages. Now, if you don't, for instance, so to go back to this idea that language and thought are related, if you don't have tensing, if there's no such thing as tensing, this is not just a matter of going, well, you can't think about, refer to something yesterday or in the future. There's a whole series of things that relies on. Human narrative relies on tensing. Certain kinds of emotions rely on tensing, right? So I can feel fear without tensing, or I can feel, aggression without tensing, but I can't feel nostalgia, right? And nostalgia is a real human emotion, and it relies on a particular form of linguistic representation, a particular way of thought. So that's it in essence um, for this week. It's the idea of the human as the you could say the language animal, or as Deacon puts it, the human as the symbolic species. Now, next week, what we're going to be turning to is the idea of the unconscious. So there are a whole series of areas, there's a whole range of areas of human life that we are not under conscious control, that are not under conscious control. So we do things automatically. And, you know, if you're driving, some of this is kind of really simple, right? So if you're driving a manual. Most people who've been driving a manual for a long time don't think about changing gears necessarily. It's a kind of unconscious task. But there are other aspects of the unconscious, and that is sometimes we do things that we don't understand, right? So you're having a discussion with someone and you just kind of burst out and swear at them, and later on you think, why did I do that? Like, where did that come from? And so this idea of human motivation or human action coming from unconscious or non-conscious sources is really what we're going to be looking at next week. Now that will end up having connections with language, and it's going to have connections with what's coming after, which is human desire. But anyway, that's it for this week. Thanks for paying attention, or at least watching, and see you in class.